So I didn't ask you to look at the text from the standard in detail. What I'm going to be doing going forward from now is saying, please take a couple of minutes to read the clause, and then I will talk to you about some of the specific highlights from it. So please could you make sure that you can see the standard as we go through today's presentation, okay? So to start with, can we look at questions 3, 4, 5, and 6? Again, I'll give you about 10, 15 minutes to work in groups to discuss this, and then we'll receive your answers. Okay? Thank you. Okay, are we ready? Do we have some answers? Mm-hmm. Some people are nodding. How does this get turned on? Okay. So who would like to go first?
Well, question number 3. How would you support people to contribute to the effectiveness of the OHSMS? And how do you support other management roles in their leadership? In this case, we discussed that we have to promote that each person has to be involved in different procedures for improving the leadership of each one, to understand deeply the safety precautions that we have to take in order to the awareness of the safety procedures.
Okay.
Instead that just one person take the leadership and promote this information. We think that we have to interchange these responsibilities and roles in order to understand deeply the safety procedures.
Okay.
That's one of the point of view.
Let's stick with just question 3 for the moment. Does anyone else have some comment on question 3? Anyone else like to say anything? Yes, please.
Good morning. Well, I think it's very similar, is something similar, our answer. And in this case, is providing course, seminars to staff in general, and more specifically to those involved in the OH&S system. Yeah. I think it's very similar in this case, what we need to do in this case. Thanks.
All right. The answer I was looking for was there are expressions about walk the talk or management by walking around. So yes, doing courses, having involvement are both useful aspects. But how can you as a senior manager, and don't forget this clause relates to top management, how can you engage people if you never talk to them, if they never see you? How can they believe your commitment if they don't know your name? How often do you have your boss who comes to visit your department? Who are you? I don't know anyone here. And you go, this is crazy. You know, people need the interaction with the different levels of managers to be convinced that they are going to work for their benefit. So for me, the critical issue with not only the awareness we talked about previously, but also demonstrating support is walking around talking to people. Now, if you have a health and safety meeting, for example, in your local team, does a senior manager attend that meeting? It doesn't have to be every meeting, but maybe just the occasional meeting. Does that happen? Again, it's about engagement of the senior managers with the people who actually do the work. That's the easiest way of complying with that situation. But many organizations, as we said, are very hierarchical. The people at the top stay in their little office. They don't come down. You have to change that, okay? So let's move to question 4. How do you measure, define, or improve your organization's culture? Do you guys have an answer to that one? Okay, let's try these people first.
Okay, thinking in question number 1, talking about the policy and of the objectives.
No, we're on question 4.
But,
okay.
In relation with that point,
Yeah.
if we try this issue of occupational health and safety in the policy and in the objectives of the organization, then you can use this like indicator
Yeah.
to measure if this issue is functioning well in your system.
For me, policy and objectives are a sort of top-down issue. So the top managers set the overall policy, and then they define high-level objectives, and then the intermediate managers reduce those high-level objectives to intermediate level down to the individual level. That doesn't really work for me in saying, how do you measure the culture? You know, what is the feedback coming back up to the top managers saying, this is how people actually feel? Perhaps the answer I'm looking for is something like, do you conduct staff satisfaction surveys? And how do you conduct staff satisfaction surveys? I've been in an organization where there was a change of manager. They felt the culture was very poor, very negative. They wanted to look at it. They did a huge process of staff satisfaction surveying, and everyone wrote their comments. Everyone thought the survey was confidential. It wasn't. And what people found, if you made a negative comment, suddenly you were in an interview with your boss and the Human Resources Department. That completely destroyed any trust and made the situation even worse. So, you need some sort of mechanism to consult staff to find out how they feel. Surveying is one mechanism. I'm sure you can think of others. But you need to make sure that those processes have a degree of integrity, otherwise people will not trust them again in the future. Okay? What about the next question? Are you required to establish a health and safety committee? Raphael is nodding. You're saying no. Do we have the microphone over here? Or the second one?
But, well, for the question number 5,
Yeah.
it is very different between the faculties and institutes.
Okay.
Some faculties have already installed all the health and safety committees,
Yeah.
and they are working every month doing the visits to the laboratories of the working places. But in other institutes, maybe they are not working well, or they are visit the places only once a year or once every 6 months.
Okay.
So it depends for the different places. In that cases that are not installed already, it's necessary to install it now, because it's very important the visits and the comments of the people that integrated these committees.
Okay, thank you. If you read the standard, it doesn't actually require you to establish health and safety committees, okay? When we come to clause 5.4, we talk about consultation and participation, but it doesn't define the mechanism for doing that. Now, I'm glad to hear that you do use them, and yesterday we had discussion about there is cross-coordination between the different institutes on their health and safety committees. They are a very useful mechanism. But the standard actually doesn't require that you have them. And this is because the standard is applicable to very small businesses as well as to very big ones. You know, if you work in a family business of 10 people, half of whom are your relatives, are you really going to have a committee to consult them? It's not necessary. So the standard had to be flexible. It would have liked to have imposed it, but it has to be pragmatic. So the answer to that one is no. Sorry, I give you.
In our case, we discussed that that depends on the risk and opportunity, the risk analysis and the opportunities. Because perhaps you are a very small enterprise, but you have a high risk, and
Yeah.
that's a different point of view. We think that depends on risk analysis.
Okay.
That's the establishment of the committees. Depends.
Okay, but if I was in a small business of 10 people, using that example again, wouldn't I, as the senior manager, walk around and talk to everyone? Probably on a daily basis.
Yeah.
You know, so why would I need a committee, you know, to sit down, have meetings and take notes? And that would seem overly bureaucratic. But yes, for medium-sized and larger businesses, definitely. You do some sort of risk analysis and say what is the best way of getting the information. Okay, thank you. So the last question, what specific actions are you required to take by clause 5.1? If you read through the requirements in all those bullets, can you see a specific action for top managers? You're shaking your heads. Anyone want to give an answer? No? Okay, so I will answer the question. Really, for me, the only specific action I can identify is, I think it's bullet B, making sure the objectives and policy are established. The rest of it is a bit like clause 4.4, where it's setting the scene, it's setting the background for what it expects leaders to do. But we can't identify a specific action out of this clause. Okay? So any other questions on 5.1? No? All right. So let's look at clause 5.2. Going to try and get, no, that's not working. Okay. So I hope you can see the standard in front of you, because today I'm going to refer to the text of the standard first. If you quickly spend 30 seconds reading through it, and then we'll discuss it. Okay. I want to look at bullet A to begin with, because bullet A says top management shall include a commitment to provide safe and healthy working conditions, prevention of injury, etc. If I go back to 5.1, again, the first bullet, A, was taking overall responsibility and accountability for the prevention. So what you can see is during the drafting of the standard, our friends from the labour organisations were trying to push very hard that actually health and safety is the responsibility of the top management all the time. That's important when we get to other parts of the standard. But it provides a framework for setting the health and safety objectives, includes a commitment to complying with legal and other requirements. So you remember yesterday I said there's an issue about ISO standards demanding compliance with legal requirements. So we've got around it here by saying top management shall give a commitment to complying. That's not saying the organization shall directly comply with legal requirements. So ISO is satisfied, and our friends who like legal requirements are satisfied. Including a commitment to eliminating hazards and reducing risks, and a commitment to continuing improvement. That's what we would expect. But also including a commitment to consultation and participation of workers, and where they exist, workers' representatives. That's very health and safety specific, okay? So let me go back to here. So I want you to do another small exercise, 3 questions. How does your organization make copies of its policy available to workers? I'm sure you all have policies, so how do you make them available? How is it related to the organization's objectives and individual workers' objectives? We talked a moment ago about, you referred to question 1, the setting of the policies and how you get that involvement later on. And is it really an effective mechanism for top management to communicate its commitment? So again, can I ask you to spend 10-15 minutes discussing these 3 questions? Yeah? Okay. Okay, are we ready for this one? Does anyone want to volunteer an answer to the first question? Do you want to tell me the answer to the first question? Yes, please. Microphone.
Respect to the first question, in our organization, make an informative brochures to transmit the information, and the information is to distribute it through the media, like
Intranet.
electronic
Yep.
mail, or through the page of the faculty of institute.
Okay. Many organizations have notice boards with critical information, and that's about the only place you come across the policy. Yes, it will be on some intranet and information-based system, but it'll be on a remote page that no one can ever find. So what is the value of the policy? This is why I asked the other questions about how is it actually related to objectives? I can go into most companies and I can see a policy statement that starts with, we wish to be a wonderful place to work, we will ensure diversity, opportunities for everyone, we wish to ensure that our customers are satisfied with quality, that we provide a great environment, and that we will engage in environmental protection, and that it's a wonderful, safe place to work. And you go, how does that affect my life? Does it really change anything? So, in a way, it's a historic throwback to when I said that when we were talking about leadership, about the only auditable requirements that anyone could come up with was, you must set a policy and you must set objectives. Now, maybe the effect of the policy on objectives does affect your work and does affect your safety. So that policy statement does in a way provide the framework for setting the objectives which, as they permeate down the levels, come to you for your personal work objectives. But it's often very difficult to see the connection between those personal work objectives back to the policy. So the final question was about, is it really an effective mechanism for communicating management commitment? I'm hearing silence. Or what else should you do? Yes? Please, microphone. Wait, microphone.
We were discussing whether, how can we involve the communities? How communities be the participative part from the bottom up, so that they can meet and report as in committee meetings.
Okay.
And these reports can go to an e-platform, and the e-platform can be assessed and see what is being changed in time. What are the needs of these
Okay,
people?
that's going to be, I think, more about the participation and consultation, which comes in clause 5.4.
Oh, okay.
Okay? But this is, we've just seen in clause 5.2, it says, top management shall set a policy and blah, 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 it'll have commitments for this and this and this. But I'm trying to say, is that really effective? It's a question. The standards are all going to continue saying they must set a policy because of the way the policies interact with objectives.
Well, we were talking about culture because it is related to culture. In other countries, culture comes from the kindergarten up, and people participate, children participate in small committees, and they help in many of these drills. In the case of Mexico,
No.
usually not. And we start learning it when we are already laboring for the institution. And then we look what the institution has. And in many occasions, because it doesn't give you a connotation of a better salary or points for the salary,
Yep.
people just simply don't participate.
Yep.
And
I
they need
agree.
to participate. This is a bottom-up, top-down participation.
And that's where we'll come to in 5.4. So hold that for the moment, please. Okay, so I've highlighted a problem with policy. I don't have a solution for it. But as I say, historically, we had to get management to define something that was auditable, and the policy was an easy one to go for. So you will see policies, but always question, when you see an organization, how do you communicate that policy? How do you make sure it has some meaning to the people who have to work against it? Okay? All right. I now want you to look at clause 5.3, the text of the standard there. And okay. So it's fairly clear responsibilities and authorities are assigned, and that there is assigned responsibility and authority for making sure that the system conforms to the requirements of the standard and for reporting on OHS performance. Not difficult requirements. The thing that's interesting about this is the last sentence of the first paragraph and the note. Oops. If you remember, I was saying a moment ago about 5.2, the first bullet in 5.2, and the first bullet in 5.1, that our Labour colleagues were trying to say health and safety is completely the responsibility of top management. Here, the industry representatives tried to fight back. So the last sentence in the first paragraph is saying workers are individually responsible. It's not just the top management. But because they succeeded in getting that sentence included, our Labour friends then got the note included. So you can see there's this constant fight within the standard about who is actually responsible for health and safety. Is it you as an individual, or is it your management? And most of the time the standard says it's the management are responsible. And we'll come to another point where we discuss the definition of hazard, where that's been changed as well. So that's all I wanted to show you about 5.3. I think it's fairly straightforward. You know, do you have clear roles and responsibilities defined? Do you have people who are responsible for ensuring the performance of the system and reporting on it? It's not a difficult requirement. Okay, now we come to 5.4, the participation clause. So let's take a look at that one. And 5.4 was the most difficult clause in the whole standard to write. If I go back to the history, and I said it had taken 20 years to actually get ISO to produce this standard. And one of the main concerns that people had was the balance of power between the organization and the labor people. And what we saw in writing this clause was originally the labor people said workers must be able to participate in every aspect of the system. That includes setting resources, setting policies, everything, management reviews. And the concerns that the industry representatives had was, effectively, that would be allowing the labor components to take control of my organization. If they are setting the policies, if they are determining resources, we have handed control to workers. It's no longer managers leading and managing a business. And this is why, when you look at this clause, it's determined, well, we can go through it. Provide mechanisms for time, training, resources necessary for consultation and participation. Provide timely access to clear, understandable, relevant information. Determine and remove obstacles or barriers to participation for those that cannot be removed. Emphasize the consultation of non-managerial workers. This is part of that problem I said about workers versus managers and how managers are now called workers. So we had to insert the term non-managerial to cover that aspect. But it's emphasize the consultation of non-managerial workers on the following: the needs and expectations of interested parties, setting the policy, roles, responsibilities, how to fulfill legal requirements. Virtually every aspect of the system is covered there. So trying to argue between the industry component in the committee and the labor component was very, very difficult on this clause. But I think the main idea of this clause is about participation and consultation. In fact, we should say consultation and then participation. So you were talking about, cultures where from kindergarten level they have very consultative cultures. Many cultures are hierarchical. So how do we change that culture? We were also talking about how do you determine staff satisfaction? That's part about measuring your culture, trying to change your culture. So participation and consultation, too often we see organizations, they say, we've set up a health and safety committee, anyone who has a problem can go and consult their representative to that committee. We've dealt with participation and consultation. Is that sufficient? Or how can we be more open as organizations to getting feedback about problems? I think yesterday you raised the question, what is the meaning of whistleblowing? Why do we need to talk about whistleblowing? Because whistleblowing indicates that a particular manager is perhaps instructing workers to work in a way that is not safe, or is taking shortcuts, or is not providing the right equipment. So there needs to be a mechanism to bypass that manager, to go to higher levels of managers, or to go to some independent body to make sure that he's brought back into line, or she's brought back into line. So with participation and consultation, yes, it's fairly fundamental to health and safety. We say that the people who are doing the work are those who are the most aware about the safety issues in doing that work. So you need to talk to them. You need to get their involvement. So it's all part of this bigger picture of engaging with your staff and trying to get their input into what you're doing and their commitment to good work practices. So that's what Clause 5.4 is trying to deal with. Okay? Oops. Now, one of the development issues that came up when we were dealing with the consultation and participation, and I have mentioned it in roles and responsibilities, is the issue of representation. Again, our labour component within the committee is very keen that companies have unions and they have union representatives, and those representatives are very proactive on health and safety issues. But again, because the standard is written for small businesses as well as big businesses, many small businesses don't have unions. They don't need to. They're too small to need them. But we do talk about worker representatives where they exist. So you can see throughout the standard, whenever we talk about workers, it says workers, and where they exist, they're representatives. One of the things I find a bit strange about representatives is how they're recommended to be appointed. If you look at the International Labour Organization's guidance, it says representatives are appointed by a union. Now that could mean that a representative who's going to participate in setting your company's policies, objectives, resources, and everything else is appointed externally by the union. So the industry people in the committee were very concerned about this. They're not happy about that process. The second method of appointing representatives, apparently, is by some sort of voting mechanism within the organization. So you can see that we're having problems here with politics. The standard is not really about, at this point, just health and safety performance. You're dealing with labor industry politics. My advice is to try and avoid it as much as possible. Make sure you have consultation and participation processes. We, in fact, defined worker representative in relation to legal requirements, and there is a definition 3.9 and note 3. That is how we compromised on defining who the worker representatives would be. So a very difficult part of drafting the standard, but I hope it's fairly straightforward to you now. If you have any questions on 5.4, please ask away. No? Okay, that really concludes Clause 5, and I want to start now on Clause 6. Clause 6 is about planning, and it has a lot of subclauses. These are the subclauses for 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities. We had previous standards like 14,000, like the 18,000 for health and safety, and they didn't explicitly address risk. However, they indirectly address risk. We always used to have clauses about controlling documents or controlling records. Why would you need to control documents or records? Because if you were using out-of-date documents, there would be a risk you would do something wrong. So indirectly in the old standards, we addressed risk. But now we've become much more explicit. We talk about the purpose of management systems is to make sure that you control your risks and that you identify opportunities for potential improvements. And we have a lot of detail here, which is really about the traditional approach to health and safety. Health and safety is you have hazards in your workplace, you identify those hazards, you do a risk analysis on those hazards, and then you put control mechanisms in place. And that's fine. And you will see that what's mainly in this clause 6.1.2, hazard identification of risks, that part is very straightforward. But then we come to the question of, what is an opportunity in health and safety? And that's a more difficult question to answer. I'll come to that in a minute. The second part of risk in the standard is not just relating to health and safety, traditional hazards, and risks arising from the hazards. We're also looking at the risk that the system is not effective. And that actually led to an issue with, we no longer talk about preventive action in the standard. In former standards, we always said, if a non-conformity occurs, first you take corrective action. But separately from corrective action, there is a process of looking at trends, looking at what might occur, predicting possible incidents, and trying to put preventive actions in place. Now we're saying that the whole system is a preventive tool, and therefore there is no need for a clause on preventive action. That might sound a bit confusing. I'll come to it in more detail later on. But for risk, as I said, with health and safety, there's normally a risk-based approach for hazards, and the standard incorporates that. But now we're also looking at risk to the system not being effective. Within the text, you will see that in certain places we talk about OHS risk and OHS opportunities. In other places we just talk about risks and opportunities. So that's how we try and separate where we're referring to the traditional hazard type risk versus the management system type risk. Okay? I've talked a little bit about why there's no preventive action. We've tried to put risk-based thinking into most aspects of the standard. So when you set up a process, you should be looking at what is the effectiveness of the process? What are the risks that the process itself will not achieve what it's supposed to do? And as the system is a series of processes connected together, you therefore build up from individual processes up to the whole system and determining the risk for the whole system. But there is a standard in ISO on risk management, ISO 31000, and a lot of small businesses have said, does this mean we have to use that 31000 standard for health and safety? And the answer is no, you can use a much more simplified approach to risk. It depends on your situation. But risks still need to be identified and appropriate controls put in place. Documented procedures. Traditionally, systems always had, we have to have procedures. You need to have a procedure to make sure people work properly, but the standard doesn't make reference or doesn't require documented procedures. It does make reference to them. But as a risk-based process, we're saying, really, you should examine whether you need procedures determined by the risk of the process. I give a very simple example. The first time I had to change the tire on my car, I'd never done it before. I needed very detailed instructions about you have to jack up the car, you have to undo the bolts, you have to take the wheel off, put the new wheel on, do the bolts up to a certain tension, and then lower the car again. The second time I did it, or doing it on a different car, the only information I really needed is how do I need to do the bolts? I had become competent in that activity. So the question I have to ask is, many organizations produce hundreds of procedures that no one ever reads. Is that effective? I mean, do you actually consider the competency of the people doing the task versus the need for controlling that task, and either just producing data and information to help them in the task rather than developing a whole procedure? Too often, companies and organizations go for procedures at this time, and they never get read. Apparently, I have a whole library of procedures I'm supposed to follow in my work. I'm not sure I even know where to find the library. That's not a good statement about my organization, but I would suggest that's true for many, many people. You know, intranets are wonderful things. You can put lots of data there, but unless it's easy to find critical information, it won't help people in their tasks. So you need to be very careful about flooding your workplace with procedures, okay? Human factors. We ask, or 18,001, the previous standard, asked organizations to examine risks associated with human behaviors. How far is it acceptable to do that? I don't have an answer to that question. You know, you have to determine, in a situation which is life-threatening, we may need to intervene quite a lot. In other situations where the risk is not quite so high, maybe the intervention needs to be less. You know, we have the very sad example of the pilot who drove the plane into the ground a few years ago. How could we have prevented that? But one of the things that we find difficult, and again relates to the argument between the Labour parties and the industry parties, was that the definition of hazard in 18,001 used to refer to acts, by which we meant actions. So that was saying, you know, a hazard can be posed by an individual's particular action. But because the Labour contingent said no, everything is management responsibility, individual actions should be controlled by top management, and therefore it's no longer acceptable to include that in the definition of hazard. I find this very strange. For me, an individual can, for example, at lunchtime, go and have too much beer to drink, or take drugs, or be affected by even prescription drugs, and come back into the workplace and do something that causes danger. Sorry? It can be.
Well, what I meant is not only that he drinks or eats something that is not good for his health, drugs, but I was thinking of having the effect of some personal affair, something that happened in his life at that moment, and he goes back to work. And
Sure.
it can have an effect on, or a hazard to the people working.
I agree with you entirely. Thank you for that comment. But the standard, because of the definition of hazard, now doesn't look at that individual level. Or it doesn't say that the individual is responsible for identifying their condition and saying, I am not safe to be in the work environment. What it says is that the manager is responsible for somehow identifying that the individual is no longer fit to work and needs to remove them from the work situation. It's a very difficult condition within the standard. But again, it goes back to the question of how far should we go when we're dealing with health and safety, of addressing individuals' conditions, their personalities, their nature. How do we try and address people with difficult situations? There is no real answer for that. Hazard identification, some of the things we've got to look at in the text of the standard. Bullet A, how work is organized, social factors, including workload, work hours, victimization, harassment, and bullying, leadership and culture in the organization. So again, we're dealing with difficult to define what you might call soft issues. They're not explicit, objectively identifiable issues for managers. And it's one of the problems with health and safety. So a lot of those things there. How would you identify victimization? How would you identify bullying? You know, it's no good saying as a very top manager, oh, I leave it to my intermediate managers to identify that for me. It could be them who are causing the problem. So this is why having some sort of staff satisfaction feedback mechanism, some sort of consultative process that allows those kinds of issues to be raised is absolutely necessary for health and safety. The other items that you're supposed to look at when doing hazard identification, routine and non-routine activities. You know, we talked about maintenance. Sometimes things have to be shut down. That's a non-routine activity, so you need to look at what the health and safety hazards arise during that situation. Past incidents. What can you learn from past incidents as part of your hazard identification process? Emergency situations, people, again, what's happening with people? So I'll leave you to read the standard on that set of requirements, but it's really the bullet A that I wanted to highlight to you. Risks and management system risks. Health and safety risks, there are a number of well-established tools for defining health and safety risks from hazards, like failure modes effect analysis, hazard analysis for operations, and HAZAN. Regulatory bodies sometimes, I mean, if you're dealing with nuclear stuff, you'll find there's a lot of regulation about how materials are handled. If you're dealing with dangerous chemicals, again, regulatory bodies have frequently published codes of practice on how they should be handled. But how do you deal with the management system? How do you find the risks that the management system is not going to perform? We've said that you have to look at risks for the management system. So there are some techniques like SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Or there are simple things, if you're a small business, like brainstorming. You know, sit down with a few people and say, what is it that could go wrong with the system? Let's look at some ideas. How can we control those issues if they arise? We talked about natural disasters. What happens if suddenly your building gets flooded? Suddenly, all the electricity points become lethal if the water's up to that level. Did you think about that? What do you do in case of flooding? What do you do in case of earthquakes? So you need to be proactive about looking at the risks and ensuring that your system has protocols to deal with them. Opportunities, I said, are quite difficult in health and safety. Lots of people, when we first started saying we have to talk about opportunities, said there is no such thing. But I don't know if you can look at clause 8.1.2 within the standard, because that defines what's called a hierarchy of control. And the hierarchy of control says, if you've identified a hazard, is there any way you can eliminate it? If you can't eliminate it, the second step is, can you substitute that process or that activity with a less hazardous process? And then it goes on to using controls such as mechanical controls or administrative controls, which are signs, emergency exit signs and things like that. And finally, it talks about the provision of personal protective equipment. Now, the problem for us is that most organizations, when they identify a hazard, their reaction is to immediately say, what personal protective equipment do we need to issue to give to people to make sure they're safe? They don't say, how can we eliminate the hazard? You know, what research do we need to do to see what other companies are doing about removing that hazard? So the hierarchy of control is quite important as a theory within the document. And what we're saying is that a health and safety opportunity is really moving up that hierarchy of hazards. So instead of just giving personal protective equipment, instead of substituting hazards with less hazardous activities, can you actually eliminate the hazard altogether? And that's quite difficult. The next clause is about planning and then about objective setting. The planning part is about planning the system, but also looks at things like legal requirements. You know, what legal requirements are going to affect you? This is, again, not saying you have to comply with legal requirements, but it's making sure that you have an awareness of the legal requirements that apply to you and to your hazards and to your particular situation. Okay? And from your determination of legal requirements and previously your risks associated with hazards, you then plan the action you're going to take to try and enact the controls on the risks or to take availability of the opportunities you identified. We then have a clause about objectives and planning to achieve the objectives. I think that's fairly straightforward, so I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail. Okay? But when you set objectives, you have to take account of the results of the assessment of risks and opportunities and the results of consultation with workers and their representatives. So, you know, when I was saying, how do we communicate the policies and the objectives and how important are they? This is saying, before you start setting objectives, it has to be an iterative process. There has to be feedback coming upwards as well as management direction going downwards. The last bullet there is you don't have to have an objective for every identified health and safety risk. Some people think you do. Not necessarily. You can have an objective that covers a group of risks, for example. Okay? So, I'm going to set you another exercise. You can read through clause 6, and then I want you to look at possible business and management system risks and opportunities, and what actions you would plan to address them, and what processes could you use to ensure your organization has up-to-date information on legal requirements. Okay, so can we take 10, 15 minutes again in your groups to look at these issues? And I know I've rushed clause 6 a little bit, so if you have any questions, please read the text and ask me questions. Okay? Okay, are we ready? Yes? Would someone like to answer question 2 for me first? I'll take the questions in reverse order. Someone said yes? So how are you going to ensure you have knowledge about legal requirements? Microphone, please.
Okay, capacity building.
Hmm? Capacity building. Updating. Okay, that's very vague. I mean, is it that you have a legal department that is required to monitor health and safety legislation and to communicate it to you? Yes? Are you sure? Or is your legal department just there to resolve contractual disputes and, okay, that's what most legal departments are like. So how do you make sure that if you're dealing with something that's regulated, like nuclear materials, contagious materials, you know, the regulators may be about to change the regulations. How do you make sure you're kept aware of that? Do you put systems in place with your legal department potentially to say, we need to be kept aware, you need to be monitoring this, this is part of our system? Most organizations are not very good at this. They leave it perhaps to chance to people working in the department to go, oh yes, I've heard, I went to a conference, I saw some article in the paper, there may be about to be a change, maybe I'll go and investigate on the internet or I'll send a letter. It's not systematic. So how can you make sure it's systematic? Okay, that's really the question. One other thing that's quite interesting about this clause is that in 45,001, it's given in clause 6, the planning clause. But in a number of other standards, such as for energy management or business continuity, it's actually given as an additional clause in the context, clause 4 clause. So is it an awareness issue, which is really what the context is about, or is it a planning the system issue, which is what clause 6 is about? I can't give you a straight answer on that. It depends on the different committees. But for the moment, it's in clause 6. Okay. So what about business and management system risks and opportunities? What did you come up with there? Who would like to go first with that one? Okay, this group over here. They're staying too quiet.
Well, we came up with the typical SWOT system, or the FODA,
Okay.
called in Spanish, which is the analysis of risk, opportunities, threats, and I forgot the last one. But yeah.
Okay. Sort of SWOT analysis and things like that. That's using the tools. I was thinking more about examples of specific business risks. Can you give us any specific examples?
Oh no, we didn't do specifics, but yeah, we just did to prioritize risk by just levels of risk, do an analysis, and have the higher levels prioritize them to deal with
Okay.
them first. But yeah, not specifics.
Okay, not specifics.
And then
Sure.
for question 2, we just sort of went for have someone in charge of doing at least annual researches or even every 6 months
Okay.
of any updates to the legal system and see if they apply to your case and if you have to update your processes or your objectives.
Okay, so you would define a role as being responsible for legal updating. Now, is that going to be, I suggested a moment ago, someone from the legal department doing that? Or is that going to be within an operational department?
In your laboratory or in
Yeah.
your site. Yeah, not from the legal department because, well, it could be someone from the legal department that just tells you there's an update and then you have to see if it applies to your processes.
Okay. That's a good system. Yeah. Try and use both. Make sure that you have a formal system from the legal department and also make sure you're kept aware within your department. Okay, thank you. All right, another group. Yes, no problem. Thank you for coming. Okay. Someone at the back there. Yes, let me give this. Okay.
Well, we discussed how difficult it is to separate this. For example, in the National Laboratory of Cytometry, they have a matrix of risk, they evaluate it, they have regular meetings to show to all the members of the team what is going on, and they are working always on it. But in a school like us, with 7,000 people, students, 1,200 teachers, it's so difficult to do this. To make a team and elaborate a risk matrix is almost impossible. So we have very general procedures, and our legal department, it's so long, far away to know what's going on the laboratories and the classrooms. And the responsibility goes to the professor. So when we want to apply a procedure like this, it's really, really very difficult for the diversity of things we have to do. What we have very good established is the welfare and care animal. We are very updated there.
Okay.
There is a responsible person who reads every day the legislation, because if it changes, we have to change the rules. Because we have auditories every 2 months from Sagarpa and from institutions like Greenpeace and groups like those, who are very interested in stop the animal experimentation. So we are always being monitorizing for them. So we are very careful. In that case, we are very updated. But the person who is responsible for this is the leadership of the group who is making the experimentation.
Okay, thank you. The comment I'd make is it sounds you're being very proactive about managing the risks. But what about opportunities? I didn't hear much in what you said about how do we look for opportunities for improving. I heard lots about very good stuff about monitoring and controlling risks, but not much about how could we improve for opportunities. So maybe that's something you can look at in the future? Yeah? Maybe. It's hard, yes. Okay. All right, so what about one of the groups over here? What about business risks and opportunities from you? Somewhere over here? No? No one's... You're agreeing with the other group?
Yeah.
Okay.
In our group, we think that in first place is necessary to identify the risks and system securities and opportunities.
Yeah.
For example, through to the development of a risk matrix, opportunity matrix with the community in the faculty or the institute. And so respect to the actions, we think that it's necessary to get involved in the top management, the workers, and activities of the sharing information and these opportunities through the implementation of, for example, workshops.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have a few examples that I put. What about the loss of key personnel? How do you manage the loss of a key person? What systems do you have in place? If someone either has a car accident and is hurt or is critically injured, or indeed just decides, I'm leaving the job, I have a better offer, I'm going within 5 days. How do you, as the institutes, react to that? Do you just go, oh my God, there's a vacuum, we can't do anything, we have to recruit someone, it takes 6 months? What do you do? I mean, I'm aware of some companies like British Petroleum, BP, where they have a process where senior managers must change jobs every 2 to 3 years so that they have the knowledge to instantly replace a senior manager if something dramatic happens. It's a sort of knowledge database, knowledge sharing, knowledge management system. Have you thought about those sorts of issues? But, that requires you to identify what are the critical skilled people from a safety point of view that you may need to replace in the future. I mentioned as the second bullet is regulatory fines. For companies, and not necessarily for universities, now if you are taken to court for breaking health and safety rules, you can be fined a huge amount in certain legal systems. Not just 10% of your department or unit's revenue, but of your global company's revenue. For some companies, that's millions and millions of dollars. So avoiding regulatory fines is a huge issue for many organizations. And the last one was about damage to reputation. That's a big risk. What does it say to people if you know that that company has an awful reputation for the safety of people? Some mining operations, unfortunately, are like that. Does it mean people want to do business with you? Does it mean that people will want to work for you? So managing reputation is a key business risk, and hopefully the system will help you manage your reputation. Other examples of management system risks, simple things like out-of-date documents, lack of clarity of roles and responsibilities. That's frequent. You go into somewhere where there's been change. Change happens all the time. But you suddenly find, there's a new job title. What does that person do? How does it fit with the previous ones? Lack of clarity. Lack of process definition. Lack of resources. Poor communications. Inappropriate monitoring and measuring. Audits and management reviews not being conducted. Lack of management commitment. That one's usually quite easy to demonstrate. We talked about how do managers show their commitment. How often do they not do those things? Failure to implement new legislation or regulations, or if you monitor them over a certain set period of time, rising rates of incidents and accidents. Okay. Some examples of business opportunities. How about outsourcing? It's quite an interesting issue. Outsourcing both for the environmental standards and for health and safety has two sides to it. We don't want organizations to say, oh, in order to avoid our hazards and to look good, we will just outsource everything dangerous. That's not really acceptable. On the other hand, there are situations where you could be doing dangerous operations where there are specialist companies or specialist providers where actually in the totality of safety, it is better to outsource it to such a specialist company than for you to try and continue doing that within your own organization. So you can think of things like asbestos removal. I'm sure that given the age of some of your buildings here, there's quite a lot of asbestos around. What happens when you demolish one of your buildings or try and change it? Do you bring in specialist contractors to do that, rather than getting your own building maintenance people to do it? So there are opportunities to look at outsourcing or subcontracting dangerous operations that improve health and safety. But other system opportunities, purchasing assemblies instead of components. You know, if you have a whole series of bits and pieces you have to put together, would it be better to get someone to provide you the completed object? Again, that's a risk you have to examine. Allowing staff to work from home. I mean, that you've removed them from your premises. You've removed them from the hazards in your direct environment. But then you have to assess what are the risks to them for working from home. We discussed that yesterday. So you need to think slightly outside of the box when you're trying to think about what are business risks, business opportunities. You can see the list about other system opportunities I gave there. Now it's 1 o'clock and it's your designated coffee break. So please, I won't get in the way of that. If we can take about 20 minutes again, come back in 20 minutes, please.